is coming up. Feast of Unleavened Bread is coming up. So the question comes up, is it kosher for Passover? And so advanced planning might be helpful in learning what those issues are that aren't kosher for Passover. And we'll start off by saying that there is not complete agreement, among really, within Judaism for, what is kosher Passover. Even within, if you will, Orthodox side of Judaism, the differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardic traditions make it different for what is considered to be kosher for Passover or not. And that is a pretty big question. So the goal of this study isn't to go over all the differences, but it's to help us understand and to finally to come to our own conclusions before full Passover is upon us. So if you have questions or comments on it, please do either in the study now or later, either on YouTube or Facebook, to comment on it. So what our text says in Shemot 15 or 12:15. Oops, I go the wrong way here. Sorry. The text says 7 days should eat unleavened bread. And the Greek word there is matzot, plural of matzah. Indeed, on the first day, by Yom HaRishon, you cause leaven, seor, to cease from your houses, your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread, Chameitz, from the first day until the seventh day, that being, hanefesh, to be cut off from Israel. So continuing on to taking a look at, this is from a comparison of different translations. We read the one above from the ISR, Institute for Scripture Research. And this is what verse 12, verse 15 says, the complete Jewish Bible. For 7 days you are to eat matzah. On the first day, remove the leaven from your houses. For whoever eats chametz, or leavened bread, from the first to the seventh day is to be cut off from Israel. And then we continue reading in verse 19. It says, again, this is from the ISR, for 7 days no leaven is to be found, or lo yametzi, in your houses. For if anyone eats what is leavened, machmetzet, that same being shall be cut off from the congregation, me'dat, Israel, whether sojourner, bager, or native of the land. Comment from JD on the last slide, previous to this, says, where there are about 36 sins which karet or cut off from the people or death, doesn't seem to be atonement offered for those. For example, Chametz sin at Pesach. Well, it would still be I think that would be, if it's an unintentional sin, it would be in the same category, wouldn't it? Unintentional sins count together, I think, in that idea. He says that Acts 19 or 13:39 seems to cover that. Certainly, if it's not covered in that, if the sin isn't covered, and you can't bring anything for it, it would be covered under the Yom Kippur offering at the time, and certainly by Yeshua today. Not as if Yeshua's covering wasn't for Yom Kippur as well at that time as well. Like we talked about with the idea of the blood of bulls and goats, not forgiving sin, but Yeshua forgave sin, so therefore he was counting for obedience. It says that a person must still bear the consequences even for doing the wrong things. Yeah, very true. I don't know what the consequences are, but I know that we had some folks here that used to worship here that it was like during the middle of the week for unleavened bread, and they inadvertently meet at lunch, and they met at like Wendy's or something, and had a burger at Wendy's, and then realized, oh, it's unleavened bread. What are we doing? It's easy to forget if you're just if you don't think about what you're doing, but do things very intentionally. So leaven not to be seen, and from 13 verse 7, unleavened bread or matzot is to be eaten the 7 days, and whatever is leavened is not to be seen with you. And leaven is not to be seen with you, within all your border. Now, there's other groups that have, I think, not used this in a sense, but or believe this was true, but I think we see from Nazarene 16 that the Passover, the Pesach, cannot be sacrificed in Oklahoma, Texas, or even in California. It says, "No leaven be seen with you anywhere in your territory for 7 days. None of the meat from your sacrifice on the first day in the evening is to remain all night until morning. You may not sacrifice the Pesach in just any of the towns that Adonai your God has given you, but the place where Adonai your God will choose to have his name live. There is where you are to sacrifice the Pesach offering in the evening when the sun sets, the time of year that you came out of Egypt." So this would say you bring the Pesach offering to where he set his name, and that was in tabernacle times, wherever the tabernacle was set up. It wasn't always in Jerusalem. It was in Shiloh for quite a long time. That was where you bring your offering there. So doing it in Texas and thinking you're doing it an actual Pesach offering in Texas doesn't line up with this text. Now, even though the first Passover occurred in Egypt, it is that was where for that particular one, the first one is where he set to do it. Nazarene tells us it's where he set his name, which is different than even in Egypt. So we see in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul says, "Your boasting is not good. Don't you know the saying, it takes only a little chameitz to leaven the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old chameitz so that you can be a new batch of dough, because in reality you are unleavened. For a Pesach lamb, the Messiah has been sacrificed. So let us celebrate the Seder, not with leftover chametz, the chametz of wickedness and evil, but with the matzah of purity and truth." So that tells me, at least, that they were celebrating a Seder outside of Israel in Paul's time when the temple still stood, but they weren't sacrificing a lamb for their Seder. As Paul says, "For our Pesach lamb, the Messiah, has been sacrificed." I'm not saying that you couldn't, if you lived in Jerusalem, you couldn't bring a lamb to the temple for offering. But in terms of what the Corinthians are feeling and living, they're to understand that they can have a Seder. The Messiah is their Passover lamb. He is, in fact, the Pesach. Okay, so some points of contention. Not everything is points of agreement. There are some points of contention within the idea. So this chametz versus chometz yain, chametz versus leavened wine, baking soda and baking powder, kitniot, cheese and yogurt, and yeast extracts, authorized and hydrolyzed. So we also have the idea of what types of grain can become chametz. You have to kind of look at what is being meant by that. And so there typically is they're called the 5 grains: wheat, spelt, barley, oats, and rye. And some Karaites add millet to that list of things. The test is whether or not, if you mix it with water, does it leaven or does it spoil? If mixed with water, does it leaven or does it spoil? And the 5 or 6 grains are those that do. Others, such as rice, they don't really, they may expand in the sense the kernel expands, but it's not the same way as leaven works for something. So you can't really, and so rice is not really on the listing of the 5 grains. So there's a question is also about, and so this is, if you look at the listing here, if the only thing that can be made into chametz is the 5 or the 6 grains, it does sort of answer some of the other questions we'll see. Is why is wine kosher for Passover, or can be kosher for Passover, whereas, say, beer cannot be? Well, beer comes from barley, whereas it's one of the grains, whereas grapes aren't on the list, so they would be or could be considered kosher for Passover, and so that's why wine is served during the Passover meal and not Hefeweizen from Germany, for example. All right, so there are some at some points in time there's been arguments whether or not chametz being fermentation, and not only referring to grains, but any fermentation or souring process. And based on this reason, they forbid eating things that include wine and all milk products such as yogurts and cheeses that have some fermentation going on. Some include lentils and rice in this list of forbidden items. Again, there is, as I said, there is some controversy over this. This Karaite view points out that in biblical Hebrew, vinegar is called chometz yayin, meaning leavened wine or soured wine. Nehemiah Gordon remarks that forbidding wine is, quote, somewhat surprising given that vinegar is called leavened wine, implying the difference between wine and vinegar is that the latter is leavened, but the former is not. The latter being chometz yayin or leavened wine, while wine yayin is not leavened. So he finds that somewhat surprising and would not be in agreement with the idea that wine is not kosher for Passover. So looking at, this is taken from a website called KaraiteJudaism.org, and it's commenting on Numbers 6:3. He shall abstain from wine and other intoxicant. He shall not drink vinegar, chometz of wine, or of any other intoxicant. Neither shall he drink anything which grapes to have steeped, and eat grapes fresh or dried. And the comment is, this is the Nazir. We see that he may not drink of chometz, fermented yayin wine, since wine itself is fermented but never referred to as chametz, then chometz, while dealing with the similar idea of leaven, is not in and of itself the same as chametz. So difference in chometz versus chametz. We also look at Yeshua and wine or vinegar. Is the description of the Passover in the Gospels uses the term fruit of the vine. You see that Peri Hagafin in Ditale Hebrew, and it's also same in Shem Tov, which could either be wine or grape juice. But the Gospels speak of Yeshua drinking wine vinegar or sour wine in his crucifixion just before he died. This proves that vinegar and vinegar products were not prohibited during Passover week because, at least in the land first century, Yeshua never sinned, and not even in the last seconds of his life. If the oral tradition forbids consuming chametz, which it does after noon on Passover, if vinegar was prohibited during Passover in the Second Temple period, no observant Jew would have it with him, and so he couldn't give it to Yeshua to drink while he was being crucified. And finally, it's more of a theological idea or comment that if Yeshua had sinned, he could not have been the perfect sinless sacrifice. So these are where you see the terms in Matthew 9:29 in Ditale and in Shem Tov. the Peri Hadafim. So what about vinegar? Well, vinegar made from grapes would have the same status as wine, so it would not fall into that the prohibited part of prohibited for Pesach. But if you had balsamic vinegar, well, that is a grape product. However, malted vinegar is not. It is a barley product, and so not K4P, not kosher for Passover. You may have seen a type of Chinese vinegar called black vinegar. It's usually made from the 5 or 6 grains, so not kosher for Passover. But some black vinegar is made from rice, and rice being not one of the 5 or 6 grains could mean that type of vinegar could be kosher for Passover, depending on what the ingredients were to make that type of vinegar.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Where would apple cider vinegar fall?
Well, apple being a fruit, same as grape would be a fruit, and so it would be apple cider vinegar would still be kosher for Passover if it did not contain other prohibited ingredients. Yeah. So what about baking soda and baking powder? Here's again from the website karaitejudaism.org. Is baking soda a chemical leavening agent? Actually, so are, or in other words, leaven. That's a good question, since they did not exist during the time of Israel, and the Navi and Gadol Cohen are not present today. In other words, to answer the question, we have to decide for ourselves whether to use it or not. For Israelites, yeast would have been the only leavening agent of their days. And so looking at it, that's the Karaite view is decide for yourselves. Orthodox Judaism says that, in fact, baking soda and baking soda can be kosher for Passover. This is on the OU Passover listing of things, and it's hard to see in the slide because this is small print down there, but baking soda that is kosher for Passover is listed on there. So their idea, at least within Orthodox Judaism, is that baking soda can be kosher for Passover, maybe depending on the ingredients or how the ingredients are made, but it's not that the baking soda itself would be not kosher for Passover. And what about baking powder? Same thing applies. There are brands listed, for example, that are considered kosher for Passover for baking powder. So baking soda and baking powder by themselves are a type of leavening, and you could argue, well, you shouldn't even be using anything in our food that would bring out any sort of leavening out of the spirit of Passover, but it is or the spirit of the instructions concerning Passover, but it is, if you will, technically not forbidden. There are chemical reactions that weren't available you couldn't purchase them at the shuk, in the market to buy, in place of yeast, so to speak, or leavened bread, essentially. All right, so that's those are points of contention, but those are actually Orthodox Judaism does consider those kosher Passover, and I think that Karaite Judaism doesn't really have definitely a problem with either arguing that it wasn't available in the wilderness. So fermented milk and kitniot. This is from a 15th century Karaite rabbi who was making fun of essentially of other Karaites who are holding the view that fermented milk and yogurt would be not K4P. He says, but some of the fools in our times who pretend to be wise do not eat anything that ferments based on the verse, no leaven shall you eat, such as fermented milk, i.e. yogurt, and fruit soaked in water. They also refrain from eating beans and rice and any type of seed. And this is because of their foolishness and their lack of knowledge. So he's making fun of Karaites, but I think in modern times you could also look at Ashkenazi Jews who are refraining from eating beans and rice because of the potential for the idea of them being kitniot and forbidden. So far, Judaism does not prohibit those. And I think that even amongst most Karaite Jews would not forbid those either, although some may it's been argued against release for 500, 600 years now, almost from the Karaite perspective. Okay, and so here's the listing of what is kitniyot. And because this is from the Orthodox Union, the Orthodox Union has not taken a position about the use of quinoa on Passover and believes that this decision should be made locally.
Sounds like a carrot.
Say again?
Sounds like a carrot.
Could be. And so the listing of what is prohibited by Karaite, by Ashkenazis in general, includes things like peanuts, corn, mustard, buckwheat, rice, potatoes, sunflowers, cottonseed, flaxseed, and quinoa, peas, soybeans, beans, and rapeseed. Just so you have an example of what kitniyot is. And what about yeast extract? So authorized or hydrolyzed yeast extract consists of authorized yeast extract. Clusterings of yeast cells that are allowed to die and break up so that the yeast digestive enzymes break the proteins down into simpler compounds. One commentator, Norman Willis, wrote, "These are neutral forms of yeast that have nutritional value, but are unable to make food rise. They will have to pray and then listen to what he wants you to do. But in my understanding, brewer's yeast and authorized yeast are not active forms of yeast. That is, because they're not able to make foods rise, they're not really what Elohim prohibits on Chag HaMatzot." So, but what about the yeast that was to be authorized, was grown on chametz in the production process? Even if the authorized yeast could not ferment anything and is not seor, wouldn't authorized yeast extract still be chametz and banned during Pesach and unleavened bread? A couple of answers to this question. In the U.S., authorized yeast extract comes from baker's yeast. And so what is baker's yeast? You might further dig into that. Baker's yeast, does baker's yeast mean yeast comes from baking bread? No. The favorite food for yeast is sugar. In the commercial production of yeast, molasses is used to provide that sugar source because it's lack of expense. And this is from redstaryeast.com gives the production process for authorized yeast extract. Baker's yeast comes from baking bread. No, answer is cane or sugar beet molasses is the primary raw material for baker's yeast production. As a kind of a comment, the Torah itself doesn't contain a word that directly translates to sugar. The Tanakh doesn't either that I've read, but it does have a word that we actually read in our Torah, in our Haftorah reading today. It's often translated as sweet cane. It's the word kaneh with a kuf. And so there is a term that would be a sweetening agent, cane, that was used and understood in Isaiah's time. It may have been understood and used in the Torah time as well, although the words translated for sweet cane, kaneh, doesn't actually appear in the Torah. So that means that sugar itself is not directly related to what is or is not considered chametz, or at least the sugar at the time, kaneh. A third answer, same for Europe in terms of how authorized yeast extract is produced from baker's yeast molasses. And you see that from the link from the European Food and Feed Cultures Association. Okay, so this is talking about, so what about molasses? Where does molasses come from? Molasses is a product of cane, and sugar beet processing. So given that, authorized yeast extract is produced from baker's yeast. Baker's yeast is produced on molasses. Cane and sugar beets produce molasses and cannot produce chametz. Authorized yeast extract is not chametz. So continue to put it together here. Authorized yeast extract can't ferment anything. It is not seor. Therefore, authorized yeast extract is neither seor or nor chametz. Kind of boiling it down into like a single slide here. In the U.S., authorized yeast extract comes from baker's yeast. That'd be a way to say it. And continue on here. Authorized yeast extract is another widely used food additive. This is not authorized yeast extract, but hydrolyzed yeast extract. And this is a slide from taken from the careatjudaism.org website. The general method for making yeast extract for food products such as Vegemite and Marmite on a commercial scale is to add salt to a suspension of yeast, making the solution hypertonic, which leads to the cells shriveling up. This triggers autolysis, in which the yeast self-destructs. The dying yeast cells are then heated to complete their breakdown, after which the husks, yeast with thick cell walls, which couldn't do the texture much good, are separated. The discussion of hydrolyzed yeast extract. What about the idea of regular flour? Is regular flour kosher for Passover? According to the Rabbinic Judaism, the answer is if one of the 5 grains, wheat, barley, rye, oats, and spelt, sits in water for more than 18 minutes, it becomes chametz, and one may not eat, derive benefit from, or own it on Pesach. It is common practice that before wheat is ground into flour, the wheat kernels are tempered with water for many hours, and therefore flour should be treated as chametz. In fact, matzah, which isn't baked especially for Pesach, is made from tempered wheat and should also be treated as chametz. Similarly, all oats are heat treated to prevent them from becoming rancid. If this heating is done with wet steam, the oats or oatmeal may then be chametz. On the other hand, barley, i.e. pearl barley, is processed without water, and therefore a standard bag of barley isn't chametz. However, some barley is steeped in water until the barley begins to sprout, and that brings a product known as barley malt, malted barley, which is definitely chametz. Well, my view is that plain flour, is not chametz unless it contains chametz. So if you can check with a bag of flour pretty easily if it's been fermented, because if it's fermented, it's going to be starting to either rise up as if it's trying to make its own bit of sourdough. If the ingredients contain yeast, then it is chametz, not kosher Passover. If there's any evidence of fermentation at all in the flour, it is chametz and not kosher Passover. But regular flour, in my view, you can tell that it's not chametz because it's not fermenting. That'd be the way to look at it. It's not seor because it doesn't have the yeast in it like that. Anyway, that is my opinion on that. And so, to conclude then, the following items can be K for P and Chag HaMatzot. Wine, vinegar not made from the 5 or 6 grains, yogurt and cheese, matzah marked not for Passover, depending on what is in them. Some matzot actually contain yeast, which is kind of crazy, but I've seen matzah in stores that contains yeast. Usually it's things that are flavored matzah, so to speak. Baking soda and baking powder can be K for P. Kidney oat are, I believe, kosher for Passover. They're not part of the 5 grains. Authorized and hydrolyzed yeast extract, as well as flour from the 5 or 6 grains that is without fermentation. What are your questions?
Would the safe way to be just Don't do any of it, even if it's questionable.
I don't know.
That would be safe. You wouldn't have partaken. You're
Right.
not commanded to partake of it, so if you don't partake of it, you're not sinning.
You're recommended to eat matzah and maror. All right. Well, that concludes our study for tonight. We're too early, I think, to do Havdalah. So we'll go ahead and close from here. Shalom, shalom, everybody, and Shavua Tov.